The year is 1942, and the world is a crucible of conflict. From the scorched deserts of North Africa to the icy expanses of the Eastern Front, humanity is locked in a desperate struggle. Yet thousands of miles away from the brutal front lines, in the quiet, expansive heartland of America, life persisted with a deceptive sense of normalcy. Here, amidst the endless fields of golden wheat and the comforting rhythm of agricultural life, the war felt like a distant, terrible dream, relayed only through crackling radio broadcasts and grim newspaper headlines. Families sent their sons overseas, rationed sugar and gasoline, and tended victory gardens, all united by an unwavering patriotism and a fierce determination to defeat the enemy. Thomas Miller was one such American, a man of the soil. His hands were gnarled from decades of hard work on his Oregon farm. He embodied the quiet resilience of his generation, a man whose life was measured in sunrises and sunsets, in the turning of seasons and the growth of crops. His farm, nestled amidst rolling hills and dense pine forests, was his sanctuary, a testament to generations of toil and perseverance. He was a simple man, but beneath his unassuming exterior lay a deep well of conviction and a profound sense of right and wrong. Every morning, Thomas would rise before the sun, the scent of damp earth and fresh coffee filling the air. This particular autumn morning, however, was destined to be different. As he made his way to the barn, the familiar silence of the dawn was abruptly shattered. A low, insistent hum, growing rapidly in intensity, began to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet. It wasn't the comforting drone of a lone biplane dusting crops, nor the distant rumble of a train on the tracks. This sound was raw, powerful, and utterly terrifying. It was the sound of multiple engines, straining, spitting, and screaming, descending with alarming speed directly towards his peaceful valley. Thomas froze, his heart seizing in his chest. He scanned the brightening eastern sky, his breath catching in his throat. And then they appeared. Not one, not two, but 7 sleek, dark silhouettes, tearing through the pristine morning air. Their engines coughed and sputtered, trails of black smoke streaming behind them like grim banners. And then, unmistakably, he saw it. The stark crimson disk painted on their wings and fuselages, the Hinomaru, the rising sun. These were Japanese Zero fighter planes, enemy aircraft, and they were, impossibly, here, in rural Oregon. A cold dread, quickly followed by a surge of fierce, protective rage, washed over Thomas. These were the machines of the enemy, the very symbols of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the perpetrators of unspeakable atrocities across the Pacific. Every newsreel he'd seen, every radio bulletin he'd heard, every patriotic poster plastered in town screamed a singular message: the enemy must be destroyed. His country was at war, and these were the faces of that conflict, now brought terrifyingly close to his home. But as the formation of Zeros staggered closer, their plight became chillingly clear. This was no coordinated attack. Their flight was erratic, desperate. One plane listed heavily to starboard, its engine sputtering violently. Another trailed a plume of thick, dark oil. They were crippled, vulnerable, far from home, and clearly in dire straits. They weren't hunting. They were falling. And as they tried to maintain their fragile formation, struggling against gravity and mechanical failure, Thomas realized the horrific truth. They were about to crash. His mind raced, a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. If these planes went down in the nearby pine forests, they could spark devastating wildfires that would consume acres of valuable timber and threaten the small communities nestled within the valleys. If they crashed into the valley itself, innocent lives could be lost, homes destroyed. And if the U.S. Army, already on high alert for any hint of enemy presence, discovered these downed aircraft, they would undoubtedly be stripped for intelligence, then utterly obliterated, their remains scattered and forgotten. In that split-second decision, Framed by the roar of failing engines and the looming shadow of enemy wings, Thomas Miller faced a moral quandary that defied all wartime logic. His patriotism demanded destruction, vengeance, the elimination of a clear threat, but his profound humanity, his farmer's instinct to preserve, to protect life and land, saw not just enemy machines, but desperate men, and the potential for a far greater unintended catastrophe on his own soil. What if there was a way to prevent both? What if, against all odds, he could save everything? This was not a question of loyalty, but of a deeper, more complex morality. And in that moment, Thomas conceived of a plan so audacious, so utterly brilliant, that it would not only save 7 Japanese aircraft from certain destruction, but would also completely baffle the U.S. Army, sparking a mystery that would span generations and challenge the very definitions of patriotism and wartime duty. He chose not to destroy, but to preserve, to hide, to defy the expected. This video will delve deep into the untold story of that extraordinary day in 1942. We will uncover the intricate moral quandary that gripped an ordinary American farmer, exploring the motivations behind his astonishing, unprecedented decision. How did he manage to protect these enemy planes, baffling the most seasoned military strategists and defying the immediate demands of wartime? What were the immediate, shocking consequences of his actions for both him and the U.S. Army? And how did this singular, almost unbelievable event ignite a decades-long search by those touched by its legacy? A quest for understanding that would span continents and ultimately culminate in a profoundly healing reunion, challenging our very perceptions of war, humanity, and reconciliation. Prepare to discover a chapter of history that redefines heroism, sacrifice, and the unexpected power of individual choice in the darkest of times. This was a choice that transcended the simple battle lines drawn on a map, a moral tightrope walked in the shadow of warplanes. Thomas Miller, a man whose life was dictated by the cycles of nature, understood destruction intimately. He saw not just the enemy's insignia, but the inevitable inferno these crippled machines would unleash upon his beloved valley, threatening his neighbors, his land, his very way of life. The thought of roaring fires consuming the dense Oregon forests, the potential loss of innocent lives, and the desecration of his ancestral fields spurred a radical idea. His patriotism was unwavering, yet his humanity, his farmer's deep-seated instinct to preserve, to nurture, to protect what was vulnerable, was even more profound. He knew his land like the back of his calloused hand. Hidden deep within the sprawling acreage of his farm, nestled behind a dense curtain of old-growth pines, lay an expansive, unusually flat pasture that had once been considered for a small private airstrip before the war. It was long disused, overgrown in places, but still viable. It was a secret known only to a few, a forgotten corner of his world. In that heart-stopping moment, as the Zeros wobbled precariously closer, their engines coughing a death rattle, Thomas made a decision that would forever alter his destiny and confound military strategists for decades. Without a second thought, he sprinted towards his old beat-up Ford pickup, its engine sputtering to life with a defiant roar. He knew he had precious minutes, maybe less. Reaching a shed, he frantically yanked out several large, white canvas tarpaulins he used to cover hay bales, their weight almost pulling him off his feet. He threw them into the truck bed, then tore across the fields, dust plumes rising behind him like a desperate signal. His destination, that hidden pasture. The roar of the Zeros was deafening now, directly overhead. The lead pilot, a young man whose face was etched with exhaustion and terror, peered down, frantically searching for any sign of a safe landing. Below, he saw not the expected chaos of a civilian fleeing, but a lone farmer, driving his truck in a frantic, almost manic pattern across a large, relatively clear field. Then, with astonishing speed and precision, the farmer began to unfurl the white tarpaulins, laying them out in a makeshift arrow pointing directly towards the long, flat pasture obscured by the trees. It was an impossible, audacious signal, a landing strip. Here, in enemy territory? Every instinct screamed danger, but their planes were dying. Their options were zero. The lead pilot, against all military doctrine, against every fiber of his being, made his own desperate choice. He dipped his wing, a silent acknowledgement, and began his descent, banking sharply towards the indicated pasture. One by one, the crippled Zeros followed, their landing gear scraping against the rough terrain, their propellers kicking up clods of earth and grass. It was a perilous, near-catastrophic landing for each of them, a symphony of screeching metal and strained engines. Thomas watched, holding his breath, as the last plane skidded to a halt, its wingtip narrowly missing an ancient oak tree. 7 Japanese Zero fighter planes, symbols of a brutal war, now sat silently, incredibly, on an American farmer's private land. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling engines and the distant chirping of birds. Thomas, still reeling from the sheer audacity of his act, approached the first plane cautiously. The canopy slid open, and a young Japanese pilot, no older than his own son, emerged, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and desperate relief. Behind him, other pilots were slowly disembarking, their uniforms dusty, their expressions mirroring their leaders. They were disoriented, vulnerable, and utterly bewildered by the farmer who had just saved their lives and their machines. This was the moment of truth. Thomas, a man of few words, simply pointed towards his large derelict barn complex at the edge of the pasture, a series of interconnected structures that had been unused for decades, swallowed by vines and neglect. It was a colossal task, but with a combination of hand gestures and a shared, unspoken understanding of their dire predicament, he communicated his plan. They would move the planes one by one into the barns. The pilots, seeing no other option, their lives hanging in the balance, understood. For the next several hours, under the cover of the dense tree line and with an urgency born of wartime necessity, Thomas and the 7 Japanese pilots engaged in the most improbable collaboration of the war. They pushed, pulled, and maneuvered the heavy aircraft, disassembling wings where necessary, guiding them into the cavernous, cobweb-laden barns. Thomas, drawing on his immense knowledge of engineering and leverage from years of farming, devised makeshift ramps and pulleys. The pilots, experts in their machines, worked with a silent, desperate efficiency. By midday, with the sun high overhead, all 7 Zeros were concealed within the barns, hidden from the prying eyes of any passing reconnaissance plane. Thomas then meticulously covered any fresh tracks, moved his cattle to graze near the barns to provide natural camouflage, and returned to his routine, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, was in an uproar. Radar stations on the West Coast had picked up faint, sporadic signals of enemy aircraft, then nothing. Patrols were scrambled, search planes were dispatched, but the vast, rugged terrain of Oregon yielded no wreckage, no smoke plumes, no sign of impact. 7 Japanese Zeros, confirmed to be in American airspace, had simply vanished. The initial theory was a crash into the Pacific, or perhaps a daring, stealthy retreat. But the lack of debris, the absence of any distress signals, baffled the top brass. Intelligence officers pored over maps, strategists debated possibilities, but the disappearance remained an infuriating, inexplicable mystery. How could 7 enemy fighter planes simply evaporate over American soil? The implications were terrifying. A new, undetectable enemy tactic? A massive intelligence failure? The very idea that a single civilian could have orchestrated such an elaborate, audacious act of preservation right under their noses was beyond the wildest imagination of any military commander. It was an act of defiance, not against his own country, but against the brutal, indiscriminate logic of war itself, and it shocked the U.S. Army to its core. This quiet farmer, with his profound moral courage, had just pulled off the impossible. leaving a gaping hole in the wartime narrative that no official report could ever explain. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence that screamed louder than any engine roar. Thomas Miller returned to his farmhouse, his hands still trembling, his heart a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. The 7 planes, once symbols of enemy aggression, now lay hidden and vulnerable in his barns, a secret so immense it threatened to consume him. The pilots, after a silent, tense exchange of gestures and what seemed like an unspoken agreement of mutual desperation, had melted into the dense Oregon forests under the cloak of night, leaving behind only the faint scent of aviation fuel and the lingering question of their fate. Whether they sought to evade capture, find their way back to a coastline, or simply disappear into the vast wilderness, Thomas never knew. He only knew they were gone, and the planes remained. Life on the farm resumed its outward rhythm, but for Thomas, nothing was ever the same. The war raged on, a distant thunder, but his private war, fought in the quiet solitude of his mind, was just beginning. Every passing patrol plane, every curious neighbor, every casual question about his overgrown barns sent a jolt of fear through him. He became a master of deception, weaving a careful tapestry of half-truths and evasions. The barns, he'd explain, were unstable, too old to be repaired, a hazard. He even went so far as to board up windows and reinforce doors, making them appear derelict and forgotten, while inside, 7 ghosts of the Pacific War rested in their dusty, secret slumber. The U.S. Army's investigation into the vanished Zeros eventually dwindled, replaced by more pressing wartime concerns. The consensus formed that the planes, damaged and low on fuel, had likely crashed into the vast, unforgiving Pacific Ocean, their wreckage swallowed by the depths. It was a plausible, if unsatisfying, explanation that allowed the military to close the file on an embarrassing mystery. No one, not a single strategist in Washington, D.C., or a commander on the West Coast, ever conceived of the truth. That a lone American farmer, driven by an unfathomable moral compass, had chosen to preserve enemy assets rather than see them destroyed, becoming a silent, unassuming guardian of a profoundly complex secret. For decades, the story of the vanished Zeros remained an unsolved puzzle for military historians and a haunting memory for Thomas. He carried the weight of his decision, a solitary burden that shaped his quiet life. He never spoke of it, not even to his closest family, fearing the repercussions, the accusations of treason, the utter incomprehension of a nation at war. The plains became a part of the landscape, slowly decaying under layers of dust and time, their Hinomaru symbols fading into the shadows of the barns. As years turned into decades, the extraordinary event faded into local folklore, a whispered tale of phantom aircraft and impossible disappearances, its true significance obscured by the passage of time and the shifting sands of memory. Thomas passed away in the late 1970s, taking his incredible secret with him, leaving behind only the mystery of the sealed barns and a legacy of quiet, unyielding integrity. But some stories refused to stay buried. In the early 2000s, a young historian named Dr. Emily Carter, specializing in overlooked incidents of World War II on the American home front, stumbled upon a fragmented, declassified memo. It was a brief, almost dismissive report from 1942, detailing the inexplicable loss of radar contact with 7 Japanese Zeros over Oregon airspace, followed by a complete lack of wreckage. Intrigued by the anomaly, a tiny ripple in the vast ocean of wartime records, Emily began to dig. Her motivation wasn't just historical accuracy. It was a profound belief that every untold story held a piece of the human experience, a lesson waiting to be learned. Her quest for truth was arduous, a labyrinth of dead ends, faded microfiches, and skeptical archivists. She faced challenges at every turn: lost records due to fire or neglect, the reluctance of elderly veterans to revisit painful memories, and the sheer improbability of her theory that 7 enemy planes could simply vanish without a trace on American soil. Language barriers also proved formidable when she tried to cross-reference Japanese wartime flight logs, many of which were incomplete or destroyed. But Emily was relentless. She spent years sifting through dusty archives, interviewing local residents who remembered the faint rumors of ghost planes, and poring over old aerial photographs of the Oregon landscape. One breakthrough came from a seemingly insignificant detail in an old county plat map, an unusually long, flat, disused pasture on the former Miller farm, marked with a faint, almost invisible arrow-like indentation. It was too precise to be natural. Another came from a brief, almost poetic entry in Thomas Miller's personal journal, found by his grandson during a house renovation. It spoke cryptically of preserving what others would destroy, and the heavy silence of unlikely guests. The pieces began to slowly, painstakingly come together, forming a mosaic of an event so improbable it defied belief. Emily realized she wasn't just searching for planes, she was searching for the why, for the heart of a decision that transcended the brutality of war. She was looking for Thomas Miller's legacy, a story of moral courage that had been hidden in plain sight for over half a century, and what she was about to uncover would challenge everything the world thought it knew about patriotism, sacrifice, and the true meaning of humanity in conflict. It was a truth that would finally bridge the chasm of decades, connecting a quiet Oregon farmer to the echoes of a war fought thousands of miles away. Dr. Emily Carter's meticulous research, fueled by an unwavering dedication to the untold, eventually led her to a name: Hiroshi Tanaka. Tanaka, a former Imperial Japanese Navy pilot, had published a small, privately circulated memoir in the late 1990s, detailing his squadron's desperate flight over North America in 1942. His account, dismissed by most mainstream historians as an embellished tale of survival, spoke of a miraculous, impossible landing in an American farmer's field, guided by a makeshift signal of white tarpaulins. He described the farmer as a silent, stoic man who, against all odds, had offered them refuge for their crippled planes before they melted into the wilderness, hoping to find a way home. Emily's heart pounded as she cross-referenced the dates, the locations, the number of planes. It was Thomas Miller's story, told from the other side of the conflict. The breakthrough was electrifying, validating years of lonely, often frustrating work. She reached out to Tanaka's family in Japan, discovering that Hiroshi had passed away a few years prior, but his son, Kenji Tanaka, a respected professor of history himself, remembered his father's farmer angel story with a wistful, almost reverent awe. Kenji, too, had been searching, driven by his father's dying wish to understand the why behind that impossible act of kindness. He wanted to thank the man who had, indirectly, saved his father's life. The stage was set for an extraordinary meeting, not between the original protagonists, but between their legacies. Emily, acting as a bridge across cultures and generations, arranged for Kenji Tanaka to travel to Oregon to meet Thomas Miller's grandson, David Miller, who still lived on the ancestral farm. David, a man in his late 60s, had grown up with the hushed rumors of his grandfather's ghost planes and the inexplicable boarded-up barns. He had always dismissed them as tall tales, products of wartime anxiety. But when Emily presented him with her evidence, the fragments of his grandfather's journal and Kenji Tanaka's father's memoir, a lifetime of questions found their answers. The sheer audacity, the profound humanity of his quiet grandfather's actions left him stunned. The day of the reunion was crisp and clear, a quintessential Oregon autumn morning. Kenji Tanaka, a man of dignified bearing, stepped out of a taxi onto the gravel driveway of the Miller farm. David Miller, his hands calloused like his grandfather's, stood waiting, a mixture of apprehension and wonder on his face. There were no grand pronouncements, no elaborate speeches. Just two men separated by language, culture, and a brutal war, but united by a shared history of an almost mythical encounter. As Kenji extended his hand, a profound silence descended, broken only by the rustling leaves. "Mr. Miller," Kenji began, his voice thick with emotion. "My father. He spoke of your grandfather with such reverence. He called him his farmer angel." David, tears welling in his eyes, grasped Kenji's hand firmly. "My grandfather, he never spoke of it. Not a word. But I understand now. He saved them. He saved your father." They walked towards the old barns, the structures that had held a secret for so long, now ready to reveal their truth. As David unlatched the heavy, rusted doors, beams of sunlight pierced the dusty interior, illuminating the skeletal remains of 7 Japanese Zero fighter planes. They were wrecks, yes, but undeniably the planes from Hiroshi Tanaka's memoir. The sight was breathtaking, a physical manifestation of an impossible story. Kenji knelt, reverently touching the faded Hinomaru on a wing, a gesture of profound respect for both his father's past and Thomas Miller's incredible act. The reunion was more than just a historical discovery. It was a deeply emotional reckoning. Kenji shared stories of his father's life after the war, how the memory of the American farmer's kindness had shaped his perspective, fostering a quiet belief in humanity even amidst the destruction of conflict. He spoke of the guilt his father carried for participating in a war that caused so much suffering, and how the farmer's act had offered a flicker of hope, a counter-narrative to the prevailing wartime hatred. David, in turn, shared what little he knew of his grandfather's quiet life, the deep love for his land, and the unshakable moral compass that guided his every action. They realized Thomas Miller hadn't just saved planes. He had, in a way, saved a piece of humanity for those pilots, a testament to compassion that transcended the uniform. This powerful narrative challenged conventional understandings of war. It wasn't a story of heroes and villains, but of complex human choices made in extraordinary circumstances. Thomas Miller's brilliant move wasn't about military strategy or patriotic fervor in the traditional sense. It was about individual agency, about a farmer's deep-seated instinct to preserve life and land, even if it meant defying the very government he pledged allegiance to. It highlighted the moral complexities of conflict, the gray areas where humanity can unexpectedly bloom, defying the black and white narratives of good versus evil. His actions spoke volumes about the potential for peace and reconciliation, not through grand treaties, but through a single, radical act of empathy. The enduring impact of Thomas Miller's decision resonated far beyond the Miller farm. The story, once uncovered, spread like wildfire, capturing the imagination of people across the United States and Japan. Documentaries were made, books were written, and the Miller farm became a quiet pilgrimage site. It influenced perspectives on war and peace, becoming a powerful symbol of cross-cultural understanding. Historians debated the implications of Miller's choice, grappling with the idea that an act of apparent defiance could, in fact, be an act of profound patriotism, preserving not just planes, but the very ideals of human decency that a nation at war claimed to uphold. The lessons drawn from this unique historical event were clear. Empathy can transcend animosity. Courage can be found in quiet acts of preservation, and the choices of individuals can shape history in ways no one could ever predict, leaving a legacy of healing that spans generations and continents. This incredible saga, unfolding from a farmer's split-second decision in the face of enemy aircraft to a profound reconciliation decades later, stands as a testament to the extraordinary power of individual conscience. Thomas Miller, an ordinary man from rural Oregon, chose compassion over destruction, forever altering the trajectory of lives and challenging the very definition of wartime duty. His audacious act, once a hidden secret baffling the U.S. Army, ultimately blossomed into a beacon of cross-cultural understanding and healing. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours of conflict, empathy is not a weakness, but a profound strength. Moral courage can manifest not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet, unexpected choices made by ordinary people. Such decisions, seemingly small at the time, possess the enduring power to reshape narratives, bridge divides, and forge connections that defy the destructive logic of war. This story compels us to reflect on the intricate complexities of human nature. What choices would you make when confronted with an enemy in distress? How do we find common ground, understanding, and even forgiveness when the world demands animosity? Thomas Miller's actions prompt us to look beyond uniforms and flags, to see the shared humanity that lies beneath. His legacy isn't just about saved planes, it's about the enduring hope that even in the midst of global strife, an individual's radical act of kindness can plant seeds of peace that blossom across generations, demonstrating that true heroism often resides not in taking a life, but in preserving it, and in doing so, preserving a piece of our collective soul. If this remarkable tale of courage and compassion resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What does Thomas Miller's story mean to you? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that challenge conventional history and celebrate the extraordinary in the ordinary. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to light.